Is Bitcoin a religion? Well, some people certainly think so. For example, a Bloomberg journalist recently called Bitcoin the first true religion of the 21st century. And of course, we have Bitcoin promoters like Cook, who's actually referred to himself as the friar and written many articles promoting the religion of Bitcoin and its religious practices. And not to mention, as surprising as it sounds, there is actually a Church of Bitcoin that was founded in 2017. Now, as quaint as that sounds, why do people call Bitcoin a religion? Well, for example, Mark Mobius, an emerging markets manager and financial advisor, has actually made statements along the lines that Bitcoin is not investment, it is a religion. And he has done that to really steer people away from Bitcoin and really to curb the enthusiasm and the frenzy that has surrounded Bitcoin. And the sort of reasoning is very simple. It traces back to the ideas of the Enlightenment. For example, Voltaire has actually said, the only thing contrary to religion and the clergy are common sense and reason. And for many of the opponents of Bitcoin, Bitcoin is in fact very religious, mainly by the fact that religion, largely, if you were to look at it, is very much irrational, not necessarily rational. And a lot of the fanatics of Bitcoin, according to these opponents, they have fallen into the entire valuation of Bitcoin without any regard to the rational assessment of the development of its technology, and the valuation just makes no sense beyond the idea of faith and belief. And now, of course, I have actually done many videos about this on my channel. You can look at where I've highlighted their points, but opponents certainly see the religious aspects largely in terms of its rationality. Now, proponents, on the other hand, like for example, Cook, they have actually leaned into the religious comparison as a means to help people understand the very fringe culture of Bitcoin and really to normalize it. For example, in Bitcoin, there's an idea of stacking sats or sat stacking. This is the idea of actually regularly buying fractionally small amounts of Bitcoin, as much as you can, and almost like a regular practice. Now, McCook has actually referred to this practice as actually tithing, in the same sense that you would actually do so at a church where you would donate money. It is a means to really support the movement. And now, it might sound strange to buy fractionally small amounts just on the basis that the movement demands it, but to actually compare it as part of the movement as a whole, to introduce this religious connotation like what McCook has done, actually normalizes it a lot, in the same sense that if you were to hodl, in the same sense if you were to really encourage other people to get into it. Again, hodling itself is to hold on to it despite the fact that the market might be moving away from it, or the realities might be totally different from what the valuation really is. But again, proponents have actually leaned into this. So we can see that on both sides, there are very strong reasons as to why people would call Bitcoin a religion. And indeed, especially for proponents, if you were to really even look at the clips, for example, the Miami conference, to see the fervor and the fanaticism that has really gone into movement, it is indeed very religious. But beyond the reasons why, actually referring to Bitcoin as religion and to see it through that framework is very interesting, because it helps us see many things about this Bitcoin phenomenon that we wouldn't ordinarily see. For example, like religious traditions, Bitcoin and largely many cryptocurrencies, they actually have a lot of very interesting and very similar characteristics to religion. Religions and many traditions are founded, for example, largely by very charismatic leaders, and charisma and charismatic authority is a big part of it. And indeed, if we were to look at Bitcoin especially, but also many of the crypto movements, we see the same thing. In the same sense that, for example, in the Christian tradition, you have a figure like Jesus. In Bitcoin itself, we have figures like, for example, Satoshi Nakamoto, this very charismatic and also very mysterious and intriguing leader that really is the spearhead of the movement itself. And just like charismatic authority, because that sort of authority and that sort of relationship between the follower and leader is very precarious, the leaders themselves are generally very aloof as per most religions. You know about them, but you can't really get close to them. And indeed, in religion, we see the same thing. We know about all of these really exemplar figures, but again, knowing about their lives, where there's no means for us to get close to them. We see the same parallel in Bitcoin. For example, everyone knows about Satoshi. We know about Nakamoto, but we don't know who he is exactly, whether he is a single person, a group of people, and there's no means for us really to get close to this person. There's this mystery and this aloofness about it, which is very interesting. It plays into the whole culture of Bitcoin itself. The other idea, the other parallel that we can see characteristically is also the sense of millennialism. See, most religious traditions, they have this idea that there is a collective salvation that would come at some point, some millennial point, that would come for a select group of people. In Christianity, for example, we have the idea that there's a second coming of Christ, and again, everyone will be put through this trial, this judgment day, and only those select few who believed in this religion or who were really the supporters of religion would be saved. And in the same sense that Bitcoiners, they believe the same thing. They believe in the idea that the fiat currency system will fail at some point. And at some point, there will be hyper-Bitcoinization, the idea that Bitcoin will replace all currencies as the major currency, and only those who supported and actually invested in Bitcoin would be the ones that will receive the salvation. And indeed, that parallel is something that you would see in both religion and Bitcoin. But it's really on the more grandiose scale of this idea of salvation that the parallel is very, very evident. And that is that for many strong proponents of Bitcoin, salvation goes beyond that. Bitcoin seems to be the solution to all of humanity's problems. And indeed, if you were to read the book, God is Not But One, what was presented there was really a 4-point model where if you were to look at the idea of human salvation through religion, they tend to have 4 characteristics. First of all, the religion or tradition will point out the problems of humanity. They posit what the problem is. Then it presents a unique solution. And then it presents unique practices that we should adopt in order to really enjoy this salvation. And then finally, also what it introduces usually is an exemplar figure who would help be the model of these solutions and to really guide us to the salvation. Now, of course, we know that through religion, all religions, they tend to have this 4-step model that I've just mentioned. And for example, Christianity, the idea that humans were all sinned and we're doomed really, unless, and of course, judgment day itself will come, we'll all be judged. And the only way is through Christianity. And the only way we can really embrace this salvation is to live through the Christian code. And of course, we have figures like prophets, like for example, Jesus, and his prophets, his disciples, to really lay the way for us to live our lives. We see the same thing actually with Bitcoin. The idea that, of course, that all these problems that might exist with our economic models, and really we're all doomed. Money printing, the fiat currency system, and the only way is through cryptocurrency, and the only way is for us to encourage others to invest ourselves, to stack sats, to hodl, and of course, exemplar figures like Satoshi, and not to mention all the other promoters of Bitcoins out there, these influencers. And so what I'm trying to say here is that if we were to look at it through that perspective, looking at Bitcoin and really comparing it to religion, and even really saying it is religion, provides a very interesting perspective to really analyze Bitcoin. Now, is Bitcoin a religion? The truth is not necessarily. We don't really know, because even if you were to ask theologians and sociologists, there are so many different definitions of religion. But comparing Bitcoin to religion is interesting because perhaps based on what I've mentioned tonight, it allows us to understand why Bitcoin has been such a unique phenomenon that has really exceeded most economic phenomenons that we have actually seen so far. And perhaps it will help us understand why some of these people who are into Bitcoin are so into Bitcoin,